Brother Terry. And so in the beginning of chapter 5, it states, "Be ye imitators of God." And so imitators from the Greek word is mimetis. It is the idea then of the word we know as mimic. And so mimic God's character. Be one who represents the character of God. Chapter 4, verse 1, chapter 5, verse 2, walk in love, be pure, righteous, and holy. And then as the idea moving forward and being imitators of God, mimicking love, pure, righteousness, holiness, that we are complete. The section that we've been working on and talking about together on Wednesday, verses 15 through 21. And then in submitting, in verse 21, submitting to one another in the fear of God. Other versions use the word subjecting to one another. The word subject is then the Greek word hupotos. The idea is to be obedient. And so remember chapter 4, you have the gospel message. It is for all. In chapter 5, the reminder that the gospel unites. It equips us in the body of Christ. Chapter 4, verse 12. A new man, verse 24, who is to walk in love, chapter 5, verse 2, in light, verse 8, and in wisdom, verse 15. Now then to verse 21. And so as we look at this then, the idea that we ought to submit to each other in all humility because our souls depend upon having such an attitude. That this Christian is to greatly fear God's power and understand His power to save and His power to condemn. And so that then gets us through verse 21. And so now the section, and let's get out our Bibles and read here as we look at chapter 5 and verse 22. And I want to read through verse 27. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is head of the wife, as also Christ is head of the church. And he is the Savior of the body. Therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. Husband, loves your wives, as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her, that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word, that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish. I said this as we began talking about Ephesians, and I talked about love and the power of Christ. And that power of Christ then is the power of love. God has shown His love for us. Christ has shown His love for us. And I will just tell you, the more and more I read about this, the more and more I study on this, the more that I feel that we as a society, we as a church, we as a family will all do better if we could just learn to love like Christ. And these verses, as we approach them, really then shows us the love that Christ has for us as God relates the love of Christ to the church. And if we can learn that, if we can understand that, if we can grasp that, then we can better understand what he's been talking about in chapter 4 and into chapter 5 of what it means as our roles as saints, our roles as brothers and sisters in Christ. our roles as husbands, as wives, the role of children, the role of the family. If we can learn to love like Christ. And so my prayer and my thought is this. God, open up my heart and give me the heart that desires your word, to truly want to know and learn how to love, and to love like your Son. And so, as an introduction, my thought was this. Paul's been speaking about roles and relations in chapter 4, verse 11 and 12. And in all this, we are to glorify God. And now we talk about roles of the wife and husband and Christ and the church. And to open up our heart and mind to then verse 25 and 27, take that to chapter 5, verse 1, mimic Christ. So love like Christ, love the church. And then my wife will have a desire to submit to me as we look at this. So I'm going to start it this way. Here's how I'm going to start it. First of all, I'm going to tell you this. It just happens to be that my wife is teaching class, across the parking lot today. I did say something about that. And she goes, well, what are you going to speak about? How is this going to go off, Aaron? And I said, it's going to go off great, sweetheart, because guess how I'm going to introduce chapter 5, verse 1. I'm going to introduce it this way. Chapter 5, verse 22. Here's how I'm going to introduce it. I'm going to introduce it as the reminder in Genesis that the wife is to be a helpmeet. And when you met me, you realized I needed all the possible help I could possibly get. And you felt so sorry for me that you realized that. And you were willing to humble yourself to help me in my life. And she goes, that sounds pretty good. And I said, and then I'm going to go like this. You guys laughing, knowing you guys all married up. And you realize it too, that you have a wife, a godly wife, who helps you in the greatest of times and in the worst of times. One then that helps us be the godly husbands that we need to be. And so as we look at this helpmeet, and how we have all realized, men here, that we have married up. What does then the wife submit to her husband, or what does the idea then obey mean? What does that mean? How do you describe that or define it? What does that mean? Okay, and so there's this idea of authority, and that's really what we've been talking about in Ephesians, right? Is that God has authority, and there's authority there. Yes, ma'am?
It says, as to the Lord.
As to the Lord, and so we get then the idea then, if the wife is to submit and obey to the Lord, the idea then, too, has to be that the husband needs to be doing what? Submitting and obeying to the Lord. And so, what else might you think about then here as we think about this idea of obey and obedience meeting? Yes? Sister Guzman?
I think, too,
sorry. Larry and then Sister Guzman.
Okay. I think, too, this is an address to the wives.
Okay.
Something the wives have to do. It doesn't say to the husbands, subjugate your wives and use brute force if you have to, or make them obey. It's something the wife has to do to be pleasing to the Lord. So it's the way that God wants, obviously, the husband to be the head, but and wants the wives to obey the husbands. But it's something the wives have to do.
And so, roles, but I think you can't talk one without the other, and that's why I said that, Brother Larry. Because you've got to get, I think, the whole entire compassing of all the verses together. Because not only then to the Lord and the wife's not, in my thought, as you bring these two thoughts together. To the Lord and obeying the husband. The idea of the verses above is that she's going to want to obey the husband because the husband is doing what? What he does in the Lord, as we get to those verses. And then the roles being different, but working together as a family unit that God has put together. And so we have to take it all together in the thought and the meaning of these verses together to understand what the husband and the wife and the relationships and the roles that they have to one another. And I want us then to get back to Brother Larry's point about what that means. But Sister Gudrell, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that it is
Please.
the wife's duty to submit to her husband. And it is a submit. The world would tell us that that means you're not equal or you're less than or whatever. The world does not understand leadership and subjection. We subject in many roles of our life, and it's pleasing unto the Lord. The husband also has a duty, and that is really spoken in 1 Peter 3 and 7. So the husbands are to dwell with the wives in knowledge, and also so their prayers are not hindered. So it is I like to think of it as like mechanical. If the
Yeah.
cards fit together,
Right.
then you move forward. It's not a
Right.
more than, a less than. It's
Yes.
a role in life. Children have a role in life. In
Yeah.
our daily living, we have roles of life. How we do it is unto the Lord. Do it as if you're doing it unto the Lord. It's pleasing.
Right.
It is not something we fear. A lot of the world fears subjection.
I like that idea. And so absolutely, as one obeys Christ, they are to obey their husband. And so, the godly wife then, I think putting that together, views then the husband's words with great respect, right? There's great respect and submission while realizing that the both of them stand together on equal ground. I think that's what you were talking about there. As far as their souls are concerned. We could look, you talked about the scripture there, I think about Galatians chapter 3 and other places like that. And so there's different roles. And we should embrace that's what God has put into place. And that obviously God understands how the roles fit together much more than what we do because God created us. And so then that whole idea of one obeying Christ as they are to then obey their husband, but then also the husband understanding how to treat the wife and that she is a helpmeet. This idea of that actually comes again from Genesis chapter 2, verse 18. And so it's Hebrew, not Greek, the word ezer. And it's actually found 21 times in the Old Testament and is translated as the word help. That they are a help. And when we think about and realize about godly wives, we realize that's exactly what they are to us as husbands and to our children. That they are a help as we work together as a family unit Two, as the verses have been talking about in the chapter previously, and then going into chapter 5, that together in these roles, doing them as God says that we are to do them, that then glorifies God. And as we glorify God, as we please Him, and people see a wife subjective unto their husband, as they see a husband love their wife, people are going to say that's different than the world. I think that's exactly right in the discussion there. And people are going to say, well, where do you act like that or get that? Where do you get the message to act like that and to do that? And then we can share with them and tell them about where we find that information in the Bible. Larry.
There's to this verse about wives submitting to their husbands, there's a flip side to that record. You flip it over, and you've got to be a husband that a wife would like to put herself in subjection to.
Yes.
And I was specifically thinking about Abigail and Nabal.
Oh,
And you had Nabal in the Bible who was a churlish man, who was a man who was not godly, who was not benevolent, and nearly got the entire family killed.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't for Abigail intervening and saving the family, but she was his wife, so she was doing the best she could do under the circumstances, trying to follow Nabal's leadership. But he was, and everybody agreed, he was a terrible,
horrible,
terrible man,
horrible,
and so horrible to be in subjection to. So if you're a husband and wives need to be in subjection to you, you sure better be somebody that you want to make that as easy as you can for her, be the kind of man you should be, righteous and such.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you get into that and think about that in the head of the wife and that word and that idea, one to whom others are subordinate denotes then a superior rank, the one who holds the position of leadership and authority. And so we say all those things that relates then to the husband, right? I mean, that's what these verses say. That's the idea. That's what it means. I think, Brother Larry, you're giving us a great example there for that. But understand then what that also means. That also means that with these roles come responsibilities. And I think that's what you're alluding to, Larry, is there's then the responsibility that the wife has. There's responsibilities that a husband has as well. And so as you read and look at these verses in 25 through 27, how would you define or how would you look at or describe the responsibilities of the man? What are the responsibilities then of the husband? As you look at these verses and think about these, what are then the responsibilities of the husband? Yes, sir.
He's to be an authority, and he's to lead. But the best way to lead is by example.
Yeah, and that's very similar to the verses that we talked about last Sunday, right? Is responsibility. Again, that ties in to the beginning of the chapter and to the end of chapter 4 too. Walk the walk, talk the talk. Absolutely. What else? So in action, break it down a little bit then. What are some maybe the scriptures describing then what does that look like? What are some responsibilities and some descriptions of that here? Yes, sir.
Love her like Christ loved the church and gave himself for it.
And so, what does that look like for the husband?
He's going to be sacrificial to his wife, and I think that it's important to understand that on a step-by-step basis. I've described before, Christians who think that they'd be willing to die for the Lord, but they're not even willing to, go without some of their pleasures and sacrifice little things for the Lord. And so it's certainly expected of a husband that he would even be willing to
Other comments I saw. I saw some hands up and I missed them. Oh, yes, ma'am. I apologize.
No, it says husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. You're going to take care of your needs. You're going to take care of, you're going to protect yourself from harm. You're going to provide for yourself and nourish yourself. So that's in this too.
That's the descriptors, right? That's then the describing of what a husband will do. Absolutely, thank you.
And to that same point, the more you take care of the body, the more your body will return the favor.
Oh,
If you treat your body bad, your body's not, so I think that's where it comes.
yeah.
Whenever it is no special person cherish it as when we're in church. When you treat your body good, your body returns that favor. It's the same thing with the wife. That's why our name says he who loves his wife loves himself. Because it's actually for the benefit of both.
Yes, working together. Absolutely, DJ. That's a great ideology and thought. There's various sayings about that, such as behind every great man is a great woman. Some of those thoughts, when you said that, reminds me of that, and that health. Be rewarded beyond measure when I treat my wife as I am to treat her, and to put her first, as Christ did. Christ putting the church first. Okay, a couple of comments.
It can be very complex, but God created marriage.
Yeah. Yes,
God
sir.
created man, He created woman. We have physical differences in strength. We have physical differences in reproduction and
Roles.
There's the roles
Yeah.
as well as souls. There's also the idea of a man providing and protecting his wife because he should be, as
Equipped.
usually is,
Yeah.
the stronger of the two physically.
Equipped to do so.
And she bears the children as he does not. And there's some complex interactions here that you cannot deny.
Right.
You just cannot deny
Yep.
that men are generally stronger physically. And it's their responsibility, as long as with some other scriptures, to provide for and to protect the family.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good point. Brother Coach.
Also, we're husbands are to honor their wives, always a place of honor, even as a weaker vessel. To love them, we're like Christ, we're really willing to give our lives up, but always honor our wives. I hear sometimes men, maybe joking or something, but that wife needs to be honored.
Yeah, I can't remember who did that lesson within the last year. I think it was Brother Harry that did that about, the vessel and what does that mean and the idea. And I've always thought of it being, one of two things. And I remember this from Brother Bob Owen. And I was about 15 years old the first time I heard this lesson from him. And the whole idea is, us guys, as husbands, we're like a plastic cup. Throw us around. But that wife is that fine china. And so take care of that. Cherish that. Realize the value of that. You don't throw that like a plastic cup. But you honor it and realize that help as a husband in the Lord that you have, and cherish that. Other thoughts? Bo, did you have your hand up? No? Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Well, it says in everything, and of course, I think basically he's talking to Christians here, and hopefully they wouldn't ask them to do something that would be what the Lord had not commanded. But if it came to that, they would naturally, to me, would have to obey the Lord, what He said.
Yes, and we need to always have that in our mind. And so putting that together and kind of summing up then the role of the husband, I wrote this down and think of it this way. When the husband understands the wife's role, the wife understands the husband's role, together putting this into action, the husband will do whatever necessary to make sure his family makes it to heaven. That's the word. And that's our responsibility.
And it's how we're going to be judged.
And how we'll be judged.
So we need to, so it's for the Lord to look at this and understand, marriage isn't a competition.
Oh, yeah, great.
We have,
Yeah,
we
that's true.
can't be conformed by the world, that a homemaker is not a honorable place. One who raises your own children is not a honorable place. We can't let the world thoughts come into us. And the husband, as Sherry brought up a while ago, we have to know and honor and realize about the same thing. Honor as a vessel, our prayers are going to be hindered. We will be judged. As a husband, you're going to be judged how you, we talk about the role, let's don't forget we're going to be judged how we did that role.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay? It's as to the Lord. I'm a husband to Dara, like we use the word work is work to the Lord. I need to be a husband to Dara as to the Lord, to be pleasing to God. Okay, and that's going to have great times in it, it's going to have hard times in it, it's going to have uncomfortable times in it, it's going to have discipline times in it, it's going to have love times in it, all of it. But I can't shirk any one of those responsibilities, or I'm not going to be pleasing to the Lord.
And so I think you can tie that thought into chapter 5, verses 25 through 27 then, as the husband. And so question 4, describe the type of love. What is it then, I won't say how many times I did this. Agapeo, the husband, everyone else is saying it right except for me. Thank you, everyone. To have for his wife, and that Christ had the church. So describe that. What are some thoughts that you put there then for that question?
Selfless.
Okay, selfless. Absolutely. What else are some descriptors that you put there? Yes, sir. Kurt?
Well, living with your wife in an understanding way requires that you learn what that means. Not only as a man in how to treat a woman, but as a husband in how to treat a wife. As a father
And to
in how
treat
to treat
her.
a mother. Yes, there's some learning required there, which takes time and effort, understanding, and the right attitude.
Yes, and the right attitude. And so putting that together about that love and some of the ideas that word means then, to treat with affection, to caress, love, fond of, well pleased. And so putting that together then, I have such a love that I care about her spiritual life. I have such a love for her, I care about her physical being, as was mentioned. I have such a love for her that I desire to be patient, as Kurt was bringing up, or a desire to be kind. And that Christ died for me. And so what is it that Christ has given to me? Forgiveness, right? Forgiveness of sins. And so what kind of patience and love then do I give to my spouse and to my wife? That I'm willing to, and a desire to forgive and to support her as I need to support her. And to give her what she needs to be a godly woman and to support that. And to be a godly wife and a godly mom. And so when I love my wife that way, her role as a helpmeet becomes a great asset as the husband and wife have a family. What other thoughts then are on your mind as we go through verses 27 there and talking about husband and wives? Any other thoughts on your mind? Scott and then, or Sorry, I saw Scott first. So we'll go to Scott and then Jeremiah.
Well, also, we ask for forgiveness, and we're forgiven by Christ, and He doesn't hold grudges against us, and we shouldn't carry grudges, or you forget about it now, but you bring it back up later.
Oh.
So forgiveness
Yeah.
is forgiveness, and y'all may have mentioned this earlier, but it's so important. Now, people change for the better, change for the worse. But when you're young and you're deciding on who you're going to marry, make the right choices. Prepare to be the Christian you want to be for the rest of your life when you're young. And make sure you marry a person that it doesn't shirk your responsibility if you don't marry the right, you know what I mean? But
And I think that's,
you've prepared yourself. Be
Right.
wise.
And I think, Scott, you were bringing on, and I thought about that this morning too, is that's that whole idea then, great to have young people in our midst and get them to understand early on. I had given this example a few weeks ago about Sister Joella Pickup, and Sister Pickup saying that you needed to think about being an elder now. And I was 14 years of age, and I really didn't understand what that meant. But what she was trying to talk about is exactly what you're bringing up, Scott, is that you've got to decide then that the way to be an elder and to be able to lead in the church is that you have to make sure that you found the right helpmeet to be able to do that. That loves God, and you love God together to ensure that you get to heaven and that you have that type of desire. Jeremy.
A big part of this love is that a husband should want his wife to reach her fullest potential. And I think that's found in the parallel of Christ's love for the church as well. And it's our wives are lovable. Now, we were not lovable when
Right.
Christ loved us, but I think it brings an aspect of this love out, because the reason He died for us is there was intrinsic value in who we were as created in the image of God. And we were created with the potential to fulfill that purpose of glorifying Him and in living as He called us to live. And we forsook that responsibility, but there's still that purpose and potential, but to reach it, He had to serve us in that capacity. And I think that goes along with what Scott was saying.
Right, right.
If you're holding a grudge and bringing stuff up that your wife has done in the past, even though you're supposed to have forgiven her, is that to elevate her potential, or are you going to be degrading her and bringing her down? And so you want her, if there is any fault, and we all have our faults, to transcend that and leave that in the past and not return to it and not bring that back up to, kind of bring her back down to earth or anything. I'm wanting her to reach her fullest potential, and so I'm going to even sacrifice at my expense for her to reach her potential, and she's going to be doing the same thing in her submission, and so we're going to be able to fulfill our creative roles in that way.
And I think that's a very good point, and something I want to make sure that we heard that word is that we see Christ serving the church. And so do we see that clearly in these verses about the role of the husband in serving his wife, in serving the family? And I think that's a great point. I apologize that I kind of rushed over that. But absolutely, the idea there then is to serve. And so as you look through verse 27, and obviously it seems to be apparent that I think Jeremiah did a great job of this, and so he did a really good job of this in his lesson last week, and then mentioned this on Wednesday too, and so I'm not going to get into it. But just remember about what he talked about the universal church, and that whole idea about Paul has a universal church in mind, Christ's glorious church as a whole. And so forgiven sinners who are clean, without spot or wrinkle, holy and without blemish. Don't forget, this whole idea comes from chapter 5, verse 1, about saints mimicking Christ. And so now we have this idea of love in verses 28 through 30. The husbands also to love their own wives as their own bodies. And we talked about this relationship. And so to sum up this idea, the husband-wife relationship, Paul compares the wife's subjection to the husband as being subject to Christ's laws. Paul compares the headship of the husband to the wife as Christ is head over the church. That the husband's love is compared to the love that Christ illustrated for the church, and that he gave his own life up for its members. And so the husband is to love his wife because he cares about her spiritual and physical well-being. The husband is to be kind, gentle, and patient then with his wife, just as Christ has been with the church. And so the husband is to love his wife as he loves his own body, as we've been talking about. I will do all that I can to take care of my body, keep it physically, emotionally healthy, fed, and spiritually sound. I've heard those from comments this morning. Great job, absolutely. And so the husband then cares for the emotional, physical, and spiritual well-being of his wife as well, as he loved her, as he loves his own body as Christ does. So Christ loved the church, holy, clean, sanctified people, because they are his body. And so the saint is a part of Christ, and the church is part of the body, and there's functions and roles in the church and as husband and wife. And what a great reminder in this lesson of those roles. And so they left father and mother to become one, in verse 31. And so God's intentions of marriage, he reinstates what was spoken in verses 25 through 27 and verses 31 through 33. Thoughts on that? You guys did great. That was really good. I'm so glad that we have an audience that you can help me learn this better than I can teach it. I see two hands up. Kurt?
We attended a marriage enrichment seminar before we got married, and one of the key phrases that came out of that for me was that, if I'm quoting it correctly, the key to a good marriage is not necessarily finding the right person, but in being the right person.
Yeah.
We look at ourselves as Americans today, and we're a little spoiled about choosing our spouse, and many choose unwisely. There are many cultures, including those in the scriptures, where the marriage was arranged. Those who were older, more spiritually minded, were the ones responsible for choosing a spouse for their children. And it worked out, and it can always work out if the husband and the wife are being the right people. And in the time of Christ, is even more so.
Yeah, absolutely. So what a great reminder there. Yes, sir. And then Jeremiah.
I'm honestly reiterating some points here, but I think Christ is literally the perfect example of sacrificial love, because he, in a sense, he was God, he was perfect, he kept the law unspotted, and so he was above all of us, yet he valued us enough to die for us. And so I think in that in itself is just why we have to strive and imitate towards Jesus, and why he is this perfect example of sacrificial love, because he was the ultimate sacrifice for us.
I think that's exactly what Paul's trying to get to as we have what you just explained, the reminder to us in chapter 1 and chapter 4 of who Christ is, his power, that he would leave heaven to come here, and then preparing a place for us. That's service and love. Absolutely. Thank you for that reminder. Jeremiah.
I was just going to point out that this idea of great mystery, I think he's using the word in the same way he's done earlier in the epistle. He's not saying that there's some profound, mysterious concept to marriage, and this is why it's become a sacrament in false religions. Marriage is understandable. It's certainly a great thing and a marvelous thing, which is what I think he means by great. But this was a parallel, especially concerning that quotation, verse 31, that he is revealing to us at this
Yeah, so you put all that together, right? Christ loved the church so much, he gave himself for it, teaches, nourishes, and cherishes the church. The church is his own body. And then husbands commanded to love, nourish, and cherish his wife as he does his own body. Wife is commanded then to be in subject to her husband, that idea to stand in awe. And then we see God's wonder. We see his power. We see who he is and what he has created as he's given distinct roles and responsibilities to the wife and husband. Yes, sir.
You know, when Christ is our example, we look at his servitude and what he did for the church in his life. It makes the excuse that we oftentimes use, well, my wife's not doing what she should be doing.
Oh.
Therefore, somehow, trying to justify that, therefore I don't have to be the person.
Yeah, my roles and responsibilities don't change because of that. And I felt like Larry did a good job of reminding that in the very beginning of this lesson, Brother Larry, is that, you know, no matter what it is that the responsibility then for the wife to obey the responsibility of the husband. I appreciate the tie-ins. Yes, sir.
Well, because so many times, people nowadays, and kind of goes to what Kurt was saying, and we're spoiled and they look at marriage wrong. To go into it with this idea that it's this euphoric, you know, love that you feel, you're always going to agree, and everything's going to be wonderful. And then when that happens, you see the marriages of the world completely fall apart. And it's because they don't have that value, and they don't understand the purpose of it.
And it's work, right? I mean, there's responsibilities. I'll never forget my grandmother, Lucille Carver. And she goes, the day you stop working on your marriage is the day your marriage stops working. And the whole idea is that every day you're working on your marriage. Every day there's that idea of sacrifice and love and responsibility. Just like every day, no matter what the day brings, Christ loves me. And that's the real love that we're trying to learn about to be able to put it in the marriage relationship. And then, as chapter 6 goes into, to then see that, and our children see that in us, in that relationship of husband and wife. That's what our children have to see. And when they see that, what do they see? The relationship of Christ and the church. And then what are they going to want to do? They're going to want to be saints. They're going to want to be a part of the kingdom and a desire to work in the kingdom. So that together as saints, working in the kingdom, spreading the gospel for the kingdom to grow, that simply is what life is all about. And there's a great reminder about, in the reminder of families and for husbands and wives to teach their children in Deuteronomy chapter 6. And I just love this idea in Deuteronomy chapter 6. And we'll end with this in verses 5 through 9. Just remember where this is and where this goes. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. Does that give us husbands a reminders of how we should treat our wives? And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. Teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. Bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. May we teach our families like this. And I want to say thank you to the elders, and thank you for the opportunity for me to be able to teach these classes. I'm grateful for it. Thank you for your time. Questions?